I'm 74 years old. I say this right at the beginning because age changes the way truths sound. When we are young, we still believe that everything can be explained, fixed, or postponed. At my age, we understand that some things only appear when there is nowhere else to run. For most of my life, I trusted what they told me, that I was strong, that I could take it more than the others, that it was normal for me to always be the one who solved, who helped, who came last. They said it as a compliment, and I accepted it as if it were love. They never taught me to stop. On the contrary, I was taught that to stop was to fail, that resting was something for those who had no commitment. So I kept going, even when my body gave signs, even when my head asked for silence, even when the fatigue no longer fit inside me. People trusted me with impressive naturalness. They left problems, decisions, responsibilities, and I always found a way. He always said that everything was fine. He always smiled. Over time, this smile became a habit, and habit becomes a mask. What no one realized, or perhaps no one wanted to realize, was the weight of it all. Because confidence is also tiring. Being needed all the time is tiring. Being strong all the time is tiring. But I didn't say anything. I believed that this was my role. Today, looking back, I see how invisible I was becoming within my own life. I was present in everything, but absent from myself. My pain didn't make a sound. My tiredness didn't scream. It just piled up day after day, year after year. There were times when I thought about talking, to say that it was no longer possible, but something inside me always held me back. An old, almost childish fear of disappointing, to let someone down, of no longer being seen as trustworthy. Now, at 74, I understand that my biggest mistake was not trusting others. It was never trusting me enough to admit that I also had limits. And this truth, although late, began exactly here. The fact that you chose to stay here, hearing this now, says a lot about who you are. What I'm going to share next isn't just a part of my life, it's something that many feel, but few can put into words. If you believe these stories need to keep being told, subscribe to the channel because they're not just about me, they're about all of us. I was born in a small town, one of those where everyone knows about everyone's life and where expectations start early. My house was simple, without any luxury, but it never lacked the essentials. What was missing, I only realized many years later: space to feel, make mistakes, or complain. My father was a quiet and tough man. He was not violent, but his presence occupied everything. He believed that raising a child was about teaching resistance. Crying was a sign of weakness. Asking for help was a lack of character. I learned this by watching, not listening. He almost never explained anything. He just hoped we would understand. My mother was different, but no less silent. She took care of everything and everyone, always in the background. He never complained. He never rested. I saw her exhausted, but firm. And without realizing it, I learned what love was all about, holding on in silence. From a very early age, I was taught to help, to look for things, solve small problems, take on tasks that were not mine. When I did everything right, I received approval. When he showed fatigue, the look of reproach came. Thus, I quickly understood what was expected of me. I don't remember an unhappy childhood, but I also don't remember a light childhood. There were no major traumas, just a constant demand to be too responsible for my age. I grew up fast. I grew up on the outside before growing up on the inside. At school, I was the well-behaved student. At home, the son who didn't give work. That label accompanied me like an invisible medal. Everyone trusted me because I never said no, and I was proud of that. Over time, this behavior ceased to be a choice and became an obligation. I no longer knew who I was without this function of good boy, reliable son, the one who helps. My worth seemed always linked to how much I could bear. Today, looking back at that beginning, I see that my fatigue didn't come out of nowhere. It started there, in that simple house, in that constant silence, in that unspoken lesson that to exist was to serve. And I took that with me for the rest of my life. It was as a boy that I understood that being quiet was safer than talking. In my house, words had weight, and sometimes that weight was too much for those who just wanted to be heard. So I observed, kept, and moved on, believing that silence prevented problems. My father didn't need to raise his voice to impose his presence. All it took was a harder look, a heavy sigh, and everyone knew it was better not to insist. When I tried to explain something or show discomfort, he just said that I needed to be stronger. That ended any conversation. My mother rarely interfered. She nodded, as if she had already learned that arguing didn't change anything. I saw in her an old tiredness, but I also saw acceptance. That taught me that resisting in silence was a way to survive. Over time, I began to swallow my own desires. If something bothered me, I told myself it wasn't important. If it hurt, I thought it would pass. If I got tired, I remembered that others could handle more. And so, little by little, I erased my own limits. At school, this behavior was praised. Teachers said I was mature for my age. Colleagues trusted me. I resolved conflicts, helped with the work, took on responsibilities. That reinforced the idea that to keep quiet and endure earned recognition. But inside me, something was beginning to get confused. I no longer knew how to distinguish what I wanted from what was expected of me. My inner voice was getting low, almost imperceptible. And the more I kept quiet, the more people spoke for me. There were days when I felt like exploding, saying that it wasn't fair, that I was also getting tired. But soon came the guilt, the feeling of exaggerating, of being ungrateful. Then I took a deep breath and continued. Today I understand that it was there that I learned to disappear little by little. Not dramatically, but quietly. I learned to occupy space without existing entirely. And this learning, which seemed harmless, accompanied me for decades. I was still young when they started calling me strong, and at that time I didn't understand what that word really meant. It sounded like a compliment, almost like an acknowledgement. People said this smiling, as if they were proud of me, and I believed it. I believed that being strong was something good, something desirable, something that made me necessary. In the beginning, responsibilities came disguised as trust. Small requests, simple favors, situations in which someone said, "Leave it to him, he'll solve it." I solved it. It always solved. Not because I wanted to, but because I felt that this was what was expected of me. And when you grow up trying to please, expectations turn into quiet orders. I clearly remember a phrase said by an adult at an apparently ordinary moment. He looked at me and said, "You can handle it. You've always been like that." There was no question, no choice. That sentence gave me no choice. She defined who I should be from then on, and I accepted, not realizing that I was giving up something important. After that, I started ignoring my own signs. If I felt tired, I told myself that it was normal. If something bothered me, I thought it was an exaggeration. I learned to control myself, to silence myself, to move forward even when something inside me asked for a break. Being strong has become the rule. Failure turned into fear. The more I responded, the more people leaned on me. Family, acquaintances, colleagues. Everyone trusted. Everyone was counting on me, and no one asked if I was okay. Their confidence grew in the same proportion as I decreased inside. There were times when I felt like saying no, moments when the body weighed down, when the head seemed too full. But something stopped me, an old fear, difficult to explain, the fear of disappointing, the fear of losing value, the fear of not being seen. Over time, I realized that my worth was completely tied to my usefulness. I was not loved for what I felt, but for what I did. He was not listened to for what he needed, but for what he delivered. And I kept delivering, even when I had nowhere else to get it from. Today, looking back, I understand that that word, strong, was a well-disguised trap. It didn't give me power. It took away my choice. It didn't protect me. It arrested me. And at that point in my life, I still didn't know that being too strong can also break someone inside. Over time, I realized that the trust they had in me was no longer accompanied by care. It was an automatic, almost mechanical confidence. People just assumed that I would be there, available, ready. They didn't ask if I could, they just acted as if it was obvious that I could handle it, as I always did. At first, I confess that this fed something inside me. I felt important, necessary. I felt that I had a place in the world. But this feeling was mixed with a strange weight, difficult to explain. The more they trusted me, the less I felt I had a choice. It was as if my usefulness had swallowed my identity. My routine started to revolve around others. If someone needed help, I adjusted my schedules. If a problem arose, my plans were the first to be put aside. Gradually, I postponed everything that was mine. And when I realized there was nothing left to postpone, my desires had simply disappeared. The most painful thing is that no one would hold me by force. There were no direct orders, no explicit impositions. Control came from elsewhere. From the looks of expectation, of the silence when I hesitated, from the feeling that saying no would be disappointing someone, and I carried this fear as if it were guilt. There were days when I felt completely exhausted before I even started, a tiredness that came not only from the body, but from the soul. Still, I got up, smiled, and followed, because that's what they expected of me, because I believed that stopping would mean failing. I started to normalize everything. I told myself that it was just like that everyone had their burdens, that I had no right to complain. That self-talk kept me moving, but it also kept me stuck with a role I didn't know how to abandon anymore. In silence, I lost parts of myself. My patience has waned. My joy became rare. My rest turned into guilt. Even when I was alone, I felt like I must be doing something for someone. Prison no longer depended on others. She was inside me, Today, looking back, I see clearly that confidence was not light. It has become an unfettered prison, built little by little, day after day. And the saddest thing is to admit that no one noticed, because I kept smiling, I kept working, I continued to be trustworthy, even as I lost myself inside. There came a time in my life when saying yes stopped crossing my mind. It was automatic. Before even thinking if I could, if I wanted to, or if I could handle it, the answer was already out. My body responded before me. And only later, when I was alone, did I have that uncomfortable feeling that something was being pulled out of it, little by little. I began to notice that I never said no, not even in the little things. A quick favor, a last-minute request, a responsibility that was not mine. I accepted everything, even tired, even with pain, even if I wanted to stop. Each yes seemed small, but it piled up like a weight on my shoulders. There were days when I woke up exhausted before the day even started. It was not a common tiredness, one of those that pass with rest. It was a deep, silent exhaustion that settled in the chest. Still, I got up, got ready, and moved on, because stopping was never something I was taught to do. Over time, resting began to cause me guilt. When I sat doing nothing, my head was not silent. I thought about what I could be solving, who I could be helping, everything that still needed to be done. Resting has come to seem selfish, a mistake, a character flaw. The few times I thought about setting limits, I felt something that scared me. His heart was racing, breathing was short. I imagined the looks, the disappointment, the heavy silence after a no, and this fear made me retreat. I swallowed the urge and said once again, "Leave it to me." This cycle repeated itself for years. Each ignored limit became another invisible weight. I told myself that everything was under control, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I just didn't have the courage to admit it. Admitting it would mean acknowledging that I wasn't as strong as they said. I've lost count of how many times I've put my own needs last. I ignored signals from the body. I ignored simple wishes. I ignored the fatigue. All to maintain the image of someone reliable, someone who never fails, someone who always holds out a little longer. Today, I can clearly see the cost of never saying no. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, it was existential. I slowly faded away, believing that this sacrifice was necessary. And at that time, I still didn't know that I was paying too high a price for a strength I never chose to have. When I got married, I believed I was doing what was expected of me. There were no great doubts, nor deep questions. It was the next logical step for someone like me, someone responsible, someone trustworthy. I moved on without asking myself if that was really what I wanted. My marriage was built much more around duty than desire. I did what needed to be done. He worked, solved problems, kept everything running. On the outside, it seemed like a stable life. Inside, I was already beginning to feel that old fatigue mixed with a feeling of emptiness that was difficult to explain. I rarely talked about what I felt, not because there were no feelings, but because I didn't know how to express them. I spent my life learning to swallow emotions, so I kept doing that at the wedding. He kept, endured, followed. Over time, I realized that I was always trying to keep my balance. I avoided conflicts, gave in silently, put my desires aside. I believed that this was maturity. Today, I know it was fear. Fear of breaking something. Fear of disappointing once again. There were times when I felt alone, even accompanied. I was there, present, fulfilling my role, but emotionally distant from myself. I didn't know how to ask for support. I couldn't tell that I was tired. He just kept going. The routine became heavy. Responsibilities piled up. Problems arose. And I continued to be the one who endures, the one who solves, the one who does not fall. Even when everything inside me asked for rest, I never blamed anyone directly. I believed that the responsibility was mine, that I should have been clearer, firmer, more present. This silent guilt grew along with fatigue. Today I understand that my marriage reflected exactly who I had learned to be. Someone who complies but does not listen to himself. Someone who sustains but does not support himself. And I still didn't know how much this pattern would repeat itself in the following years. When my children were born, something in me was reinforced. I felt that I needed to be even stronger, even firmer, even more present. There was no room for hesitation. I became the provider, the support, the base. And I embraced this role as if it were my greatest obligation. I prided myself on not missing anything. I worked more, slept less, ignored clear signs of wear. He always said that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. I believed that being a father was this: ensuring safety, even if the price was too high. Over time, my children learned to count on me for everything. Problems, decisions, doubts. I was always there, always available, always ready to solve. And somehow it pushed me away from them emotionally, because I never showed weakness, never showed tiredness, never showed who I really was. There were times when I wanted to sit down and just talk, not to solve anything, just to be. But something in me didn't allow it. I didn't know how to be a father without being supportive. I didn't know how to be present without carrying everything on my back. As they grew older, the responsibilities did not diminish. They just changed shape. New problems, new concerns, new expectations. And I kept saying yes. He continued to assume. I continued to believe that this was love. Inside, however, something was wearing away. I felt a tiredness that I couldn't explain, a constant feeling of always owing someone something. Even when everything seemed under control, I felt behind on myself. I never talked about it with them. I didn't want to worry. He didn't want to appear weak. I didn't want to break the image I built. So I remained silent, as I always did. A silence that seemed like protection, but that also isolated me. Today I understand that I was a father present and absent at the same time. Present in actions, absent in emotions. I gave everything I had, but I never showed how much it cost me. And this cost continued to grow, silently. It wasn't suddenly. My body didn't break all at once like something that falls and shatters. He began to warn little by little, in details too small to draw the attention of those looking from the outside. A fatigue that did not go away. A pain that appeared for no reason. A strange slowness in the simplest gestures. At first, I ignored it. I always ignored it. I told myself that it was age coming, that it was normal, that I was part of it. After all, I had already endured so much that it seemed little. I kept waking up early, solving problems, fulfilling commitments, even though I felt that something was different. The nights began to change. I lay down tired, but sleep did not come. When it came, it was light, broken, full of thoughts. My head wouldn't hang up. I passed on things I needed to do, people who depended on me, situations that were not yet resolved. My body wanted to stop, but my mind wouldn't allow it. I began to forget simple things. Where I left something, what he had gone to get. Small lapses that made me uneasy. I laughed, made jokes, disguised it. I didn't want to give cause for concern. I didn't want to hear that I needed to slow down. Decreasing has always sounded to me like giving up. There were days when getting out of bed required effort. Not only physical, but emotional. I felt a strange weight in my chest, as if I was carrying something invisible. Still, I got up, because I always got up, because someone needed me. The people around me didn't notice. Or maybe they realized it and preferred not to see it. After all, I continued to function. He kept solving. He kept saying that everything was fine. And while I was saying that, my body was saying the opposite. I even thought about seeking help, but soon dismissed this idea. I couldn't explain what I felt. It was not just one thing. It was an accumulation. And how to explain years of silence in a few words. Today, I know that those warnings were requested. My body was asking for a break. He asked for care. He asked for a limit. But I wasn't ready to listen yet. I kept walking, even tired, not realizing that I was getting closer and closer to my own limit. Here's Chapter 10, Keeping First Person, 8 paragraphs long, Deepening Emotional Loneliness, and the contrast between external confidence and internal invisibility. At the end, I stop and wait for your okay. Chapter 10, Everyone Trusted Me. It was curious to see how everyone trusted me, and at the same time, almost no one really saw me. People arrived with problems, decisions, requests. They spoke to me as someone who deposits something heavy and comes out lighter. I stood there, holding everything while they moved on. I was the first to be called when something went wrong, the last to be remembered when all was well. This logic was repeated so many times that it began to seem normal. After all, I always managed it. I always found a way. I have always been available. What no one asked was how I was. Not out of malice, I believe, but because I never gave clear signals. I smiled. I agreed. I said everything was fine, and people believed it, perhaps because it was easier to believe. There were days when I felt a loneliness that was difficult to explain. I was surrounded by people, but I felt alone. Not because there was a lack of people, but because there was a lack of space to be more than useful. I wasn't seen as someone who needed it either. Sometimes I found myself wondering what would happen if I just stopped, if I said I couldn't do it anymore, if I really failed. Would anyone notice my tiredness? Or would they just miss what I was doing? This question scared me, because deep down, I was already suspicious of the answer. Everyone trusted me because I never stopped working, and as long as I functioned, no one would have reason to look any closer. I began to realize that my invisibility was the result of years of silence. I taught people not to ask me. I taught him that I was always fine. I taught him that I could handle it. And now, reaping this result hurt more than I imagined. It was during this period that the weight became almost unbearable. It wasn't just the tired body. It was the feeling of existing only to support others. And even so, I continued, because I still didn't know how to stop. The day I failed didn't start any different from the others. I woke up tired, as I had already been doing, but I told myself that it would pass. It has always passed. I had a simple commitment, something I had been doing for years without difficulty. Nothing that justified concern. However, that day, my body did not respond as before. The movements were slow, the head confused. I tried to concentrate, but it seemed that everything required a greater effort than usual. Still, I kept going, pretending that everything was under control. When I realized that I could not fulfill what I had promised, I felt a strange butterflies in my stomach. It wasn't just frustration. It was fear. A deep fear of failing, of disappointing, of showing that I was no longer the same as always. I tried to insist. I pushed a little harder. I ignored the signs. But there came a time when it just didn't work. I stopped. I stood there, motionless, feeling the weight of something I had never felt before. Impotence. The hardest thing was not failing. That's what came next. Silence. The look of people trying to understand what was happening. Some offered help, but in a strange, almost uncomfortable way, as if they didn't know how to deal with me that way. I felt small, not because of the situation itself, but because my whole identity was tied to never failing. And there, at that moment, that identity began to crack. If I couldn't do it anymore, who was I? I returned home with this question hammering in my head. I sat in silence, not knowing what to feel. Shame, sadness, fear, all mixed together. For the first time, I realized that my greatest fear was not fatigue. It was no longer necessary. That day marked something in me. It was not a collapse visible to the world, but it was an internal rupture, something that could no longer be ignored. For the first time, I understood that continuing to fake it was no longer possible. What comes now is the hardest part to say out loud. Sharing this means exposing years of silence, guilt, and strength that have cost me more than I like to admit. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some truths need to be told so they don't consume us inside. So sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture to preserve voices that have spent too much time silent. Sometime after that day, I finally sought help. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't pretend that everything was okay anymore. I sat in front of someone who didn't know me, someone who didn't expect anything from me but the truth, and for the first time, I didn't know where to start. I explained the symptoms vaguely. The tiredness, the sleepless nights, the constant feeling of heaviness. I spoke as I always did, minimizing, justifying, trying to appear strong until then. I expected to hear that it was normal, that it was age, that it was enough to slow down a little. The person listened to me in silence for a few minutes, and then said something simple, almost ordinary, something that did not come loaded with judgment or drama. He only said, "You live as if you were not allowed to rest." That sentence was suspended in the air. At first, I wanted to disagree. I wanted to explain, justify, argue, but I couldn't. Something inside me gave way, as if someone had put words into something I felt all my life, but never been able to name. That phrase began to echo inside me, permission to rest. I had never thought of it that way. I always believed that resting was something that is achieved after completing everything, and I never fulfilled everything, because there was always more. I left there different, although nothing had changed on the outside. I walked down the street slowly, observing simple things. People sitting, talking, living. For the first time, I wondered when I had stopped living and started just functioning. Over the next few days, I began to revisit my own story. I remembered the phrases, the expectations, the silence. I began to realize that much of what I carried was not my choice, nor my fault. It was something that was put to me too soon and never questioned. It was not an immediate relief. It was a beginning, a new, almost painful discomfort, because understanding that it wasn't my fault also meant facing everything I had lost trying to be who they expected. And this truth, while liberating, also hurt. After that sentence, something inside me began to reorganize. It was not quick or easy. It was like fiddling with boxes that had been stored for decades, full of things that I avoided touching. Each memory was accompanied by a question that I had never allowed myself to ask. Why did I think I had to endure everything alone? I started to look at my past with different eyes. The demands, the silences, the expectations. Everything that I had always treated as normal began to take on another meaning. It was not strength. It was adaptation. It was not a choice. It was learning. And I learned too soon to shut up. I realized how much I was controlled by ideas that I never questioned. The idea that my value was in serving, that resting was weakness, that saying no was selfish. These ideas have accompanied me as absolute truths, when in reality they were just silent rules imposed over time. Guilt has always been present in my life, even for no clear reason. Guilt for getting tired, guilt for thinking of me, guilt for imagining a different life. And, little by little, I began to understand that this guilt was not born with me. It was built, reinforced, repeated until it felt like part of who I was. There were difficult moments in this process. Understanding that it wasn't my fault meant admitting that I was hurt in subtle, almost invisible ways. Not out of direct malice, but out of a constant normalization of my silence. And that hurts, because there is no clear culprit to point to. At the same time, this understanding brought something new. Relief. A timid relief. Still fragile, but real. For the first time, I didn't feel weak because I was tired. I felt human, and that changed everything. I started talking to myself in a different way, with less charge, with less harshness. I came to accept that I did what I could with the tools I had, and that now, perhaps, I could learn something different. It wasn't my fault. I repeated this several times, almost like a workout, because after a lifetime of believing otherwise, that truth needed to be relearned. And at that moment, I knew there was no turning back. Something in me had awakened. Saying no didn't happen all at once. It was not a firm decision or a prepared speech. It was small, almost shy. A simple request, made as it has always been done, and for the first time I hesitated. My heart raced. My mouth dried up. But still, I said I couldn't. The silence that came after was strange. There was no discussion, no direct disapproval. Just a brief discomfort in the air, as if something had moved out of place. That shook me more than any confrontation would have shaken. I wasn't used to occupying that space. In the following days, other situations arose. Requests, expectations, demands. And I started to choose more carefully. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I said no. And each no was accompanied by guilt, insecurity, a feeling of doing something wrong. I felt selfish for thinking about myself. Even though I knew I needed to, even though I felt the limit in my body, guilt appeared. It was as if an old voice whispered that I was failing, that I was changing too much, that I was no longer who I had always been. Some people were surprised. Others accepted without question. And that surprised me. I realized that much of the fear I carried came from within, not from without. I had created scenarios worse than reality. Still, it wasn't easy. There were days when I gave in just to avoid discomfort. Others where I stood my ground and then spent hours thinking if I had done the right thing. Changing after so many years requires relearning everything. Little by little, I began to feel something different. A discreet, almost imperceptible relief. A new space inside me. It was not complete happiness, but it was silence. A silence that didn't hurt. Saying no didn't make me a worse person. It didn't take me away from everyone. It didn't destroy my story. It just gave me back a piece of me that I had lost long ago. And for the first time, that seemed enough. Today, at the age of 74, when I look at my life with the distance that only time allows, I don't feel anger as I imagined I would. I feel clarity. A silent clarity, sometimes painful, but necessary. I spent most of my existence believing that my value lay in how much I endured without complaining, in how much I could endure in silence. I was praised for that. I was respected for that. And for a long time, I confused this recognition with love. It took me a while to realize that being strong all the time is not a virtue when it is accompanied by abandonment of oneself. It's just survival disguised as character. I can't go back. I can't give myself back the years when I ignored tiredness, the times when I swallowed words, the nights when I went to bed exhausted thinking that was normal. The past does not move, but the way I look at it has completely changed. Today, I acknowledge my history without attacking myself. I can say that I did what I could with what I was taught, that I remained quiet, because I learned early on that this was how peace was kept. And understanding this does not erase the pain, but removes the weight of guilt. I learned, perhaps too late, that constant silence hurts, that saying yes always erases one's own identity, that being trustworthy should not mean giving up one's own health, one's own voice, one's emotional existence. These lessons didn't come when I was young. They have come now, and yet they came. Today, I rest without apologizing. Still strange that. Sometimes I find myself justifying, explaining, as if I needed permission. But now I stop. I breathe, and I follow. Because I know that my body and mind no longer have to pay for old expectations. If you who are listening to this story recognize yourself in me, I want you to know something important. It is not too late. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how much time you spent silent, being strong, being support for everyone. Your tiredness is legitimate. Its limits exist, and they deserve respect. I spent a lifetime believing what I was told, that it was normal, that it was love, that it was just like that. Today I know it wasn't. And this truth, even arriving late, still matters. Some truths wait a lifetime to be told, but when they finally appear, they still have the strength to save us. If this story touched you on any level, please share this video. It's not just about an individual experience, but about patterns that teach people to shut up for a lifetime. By sharing, you can get those words out to someone who still feels like they have to endure it all alone, and that's sometimes the beginning of change. I'll stay here reading every comment. Tell me what city and country you're watching from, and what about this story has stuck with you, because reading these answers really matters to me.